The work I did in Cape Town was quite exhausting. I saw people in their homes to treat them. I treated a lot of people in the hospital, and of course I had been giving some demonstrations. So I was very pleased when my relations suggested we go on a little trip. They were going to take me up to the Kruger National Park, one of the largest wildlife parks in the world, and I was looking forward to it. I didn't realize how the journey would be, because in those days only part of the road from Cape Town to Johannesburg was actually made up. The distance between the two towns is 1,000 miles, and only the first 50 miles were asphalt tarmacked from Cape Town into the desert, and then out again from the desert to Johannesburg, another 50 miles, ready-made roads. The rest was just sand. So if there was a car in front of you, you literally had to wait about 20 minutes for the dust to clear before you could continue. And of course it was very hot and humid, and the only way you could carry drinking water was to have it on a large canvas bottle on the front of the car, so whilst you're driving, at least it was cooled just a little bit. Anyway, we'd been driving for a long time, when suddenly I saw a red glow on the horizon. I asked my relations whether they knew whether there would be a forest fire or something like that, and they were just as puzzled as I was. And as we got closer and closer, I realized it wasn't a fire. In the middle of the desert was a large neon sign on a pylon very high up saying, "Drink Coca-Cola." It couldn't have been more appropriate, because everyone by that time would be very thirsty and very dry. And Coca-Cola were very clever. They realized that in future a town would be built there once they had the roads, and I believe that the pylon was still in the middle of the town when it was built, so it was very clever advertising. Anyway, we drove past that, and after many hours we arrived in Johannesburg. And then we went to the Kruger National Park, where most people only stay 1 or 2 days, but we stayed 4 days. That meant 3 nights in a small hut called a rondavo. We had one each, and there were a lot of native boys to help us out. They fetched the water and they made up the fires to cook the food on. It was wonderful. So I thought I'd entertain them a little bit with some magic. And you can imagine, I had this on film, that some of the faces were really black. And I produced something from behind the ears, a very white egg. And the contrast of this white egg being produced from the black hair was quite dramatic, and the big smile of his teeth showing. We had a wonderful time looking at the animals feeding and going to their water holes. We saw all kinds of animals, and it was really fascinating. My cousin filmed everything and took numerous photographs, and I was very proud of his achievements, because we saw a few things that you would normally not see. We, for instance, saw a giraffe mating, and I don't think many people would have seen that. Well, on the way back, we went to visit their friend again, and we left all our luggage and the cameras and everything in the car, rather foolishly, because when we came out, the cameras and all the valuables had been stolen from the car. Disaster. We had all those films and all the cameras that we'd been using all that time. And then when we told the police, they actually said they found the film that had been taken out of the camera. They only wanted to keep the cameras, and the film was found in a pond and completely ruined. Pretty disastrous, although I still have a few photographs from that time. And from there we went into Portuguese East Africa to a town called Lourenço Marques. A very unusual town, very nice, and they had one big luxury hotel called the Palana Hotel, where we stayed. Well, by chance, we met the owner, which was a young man called John Schlesinger. His father had been a poor immigrant who had come to South Africa with virtually nothing. And then by hard work, he managed to start a small cafe, a restaurant, then he bought a few more restaurants. Finally, he finished up owning nearly every cinema and every restaurant in South Africa, became a multi-millionaire. And he handed everything over to his son, who was in his mid-20s, and suddenly had to run this big empire that he'd created. I happen to have seen a short film in Cape Town where they talked about this man, so I knew something about it. Well, one night, about 12 of us went out to a nightclub in Laurentum, and there was a band that I just couldn't believe. The sound they created was fantastic. There were 26 musicians, only guitars of every shape and size, and drums. And they created the most incredible sound. It could have been a full orchestra. And one particular tune they played I really liked. So I went up to the band leader and said to him, "May I introduce myself? I'm from London. I really love that tune. What is it called?" And he said, "It's called Coimbra." Now, Coimbra is a town in Portugal. And I said, "I'd love to take that back to London, maybe get it published." And he was very pleased and very excited because he had written that tune. And it was later called Abril a Portugal in French, and then it was changed to April in Portugal and became a huge international hit. Many years later, when I went into show business, I used that for my signature tune. From the very first day when I started, I used it to play me on, to play me off, and then it was played by every conceivable orchestra, trio, pianist, symphony orchestras, whatever I had behind me, wherever I was working, they would play it. And once I got established on television, people often said, "You know, I was in the kitchen and I heard April in Portugal, and I knew it must have been you," and they came to watch me. Yes, it stayed my signature tune for over 60 years. I was very impressed to meet John, but he didn't look like the sort of person who would be able to run that sort of huge business. He was more like a playboy. One night we went out with his friends. He had rather too much to drink. There was a restaurant where they served green wine and green prawns, huge plates full of prawns, and we all had quite a lot, maybe too much, and too much wine. And on the way back, John was quite drunk, and just for fun he took off one of his shoes and threw it up in the air, and the second time it went through somebody's window. And he decided he must retain his shoe, and so he climbed the lamppost to try and reach the window and climb into the window, but it was too far away. And at that moment, 2 Spanish policemen came along. I say Spanish because Portuguese East Africa have the same sort of policemen they have in Spain and Portugal, with those flat caps at the back and with a gun in their holster. And they arrested him, and of course we had to go along to the actual police station where he was locked up. And it took quite a few phone calls before he was bailed out to explain who he was, and he apologized and he was fined a small fine. Well, we got back to the hotel and he suddenly remembered that he had to attend a meeting of the management to discuss some important things, and he was so drunk I didn't think he could do it. And he said, "Well, we'll go and have a swim first." So he put on a bathrobe and a straw hat and sunglasses. We went to the pool. He went up to the top diving board. He walked along it, and he just kept walking, fully clothed, until he was under the water. And when he came out, he seemed to be totally sober. He went to his room, he got dressed in a nice suit and a tie, and then he asked me to come with him to the meeting. And I was amazed how informed he was and how well he ran that meeting. Anyway, he and I became good friends, and I had a lot of fun meeting him. And then we traveled back, but through Johannesburg again. And there again was the best hotel called the Carlton Hotel, which is owned by John Schlesinger. We stayed there, and it was a very luxurious hotel. You would forget that you were in the middle of Africa, until one episode that happened when we went up to the bar and the restaurant. The waiters were serving absolutely perfectly with white gloves, white coats. They knew the menu backwards, they knew all the drinks. You could have been anywhere in Europe. They were absolutely immaculate with the knowledge and with the way they served. And then I started doing some tricks, and they started cowering away. And it was the first time that I realized there's still a huge difference between the sort of training they'd had from the Europeans to the native beliefs, because they believed what I was doing was real magic. And they started cowering away, and I started joking and trying to make it lightheartedly. But when I showed them a card trick, where I actually get the card to come out of the pack, a chosen card comes out of the pack by itself, it rises up slowly, they got terrified. And when I put the pack down against the bottle, leant back, asked somebody what card they thought of, and the card came up by itself, they all disappeared into the kitchen, and nothing would persuade them to come back. So I had to go in the kitchen and start doing little coin tricks with them and pulling things from behind the ears and smiling and explaining that it was just my kind of magic before they would come back. But it did teach me a lesson that there was still a big divide between the culture in Africa and the sort of European training that they had in the hotel. Well, having had a really good holiday in the Kruger Park and Laurentia Marx and Johannesburg, we traveled back to Cape Town, and I went back to work for a few more months.